Welcome to Inside the Hype.tv podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Humberto Cristiano. In this podcast, we talk about the teachings of the most successful society in natural history, the honeybees. It doesn't matter if you're a beginner, an advanced beekeeper, or just curious about honeybees. Here, you'll find great conversations to educate and entertain yourself about this wonderful insect. From honeybee biology to how to make money with honeybees, you won't miss anything here. Inside the Hype.tv podcast is brought to you by our fans on Patreon. On Patreon, you can access all episodes before anybody else and exclusive content, like behind-the-scenes videos, live streams, and more. If you want to learn more about honeybees and help me to make more content about honeybees to everybody, please visit patreon.com/InsideTheHypeTV and join our community. In this episode, Dr. Sanford and I discussed my live stream interview with Dr. Mohammed Alburaki. We talked about Dr. Alburaki's latest scientific publication, which found out that honeybees population in the United States have a very low genetic diversity. Dr. Sanford provided his perspective on the subject, and we both discussed the emergence of the first truly American honeybee haplotype, which is starting to appear in different parts of the United States and was identified in Dr. Alburaki's study. It is a fascinating subject, and we hope you enjoy listening to it. All right, Professor, Dr. Malcolm, what we have in mind today? Are we going to react to the podcast of Dr. Mohammed Alburaki? I know you were very interested in that conversation, and I'm sure you have something to add to it.
Well, there's no question about that. And what we're looking at now, of course, is the situation with and how you determine the races of bees. In the past, it was done by morphometrics, and that was basically is measuring bees, various categories of measuring the length of the bees' wings and whatever else, and it was all about measurements, physical measurements. And now, of course, it's genetics. And so that's what he's broaching on this whole area. You got a whole new concept of trying to figure out what bees are where. And that's going to be, and that's what you're talking about, kind of interested in, is looking at, of course, we're more interested in looking at the U.S., but we also should be looking at other areas around the world, too, that have a whole new world opening up to them in terms of genetics.
Before we go into the details that I know, I want to get your perspective about the historical perspective of how people measure those things in the past, how genetics get involved, and we can discuss the details on that. I want to give you a little overview about what this conversation is going to be about it, because maybe people are just tuning in and don't know anything, but doesn't know about the podcast, doesn't know about the conversation I got with Dr. Alburaki. So what's going on is that I have a live stream with Dr. Mohammed Alburaki, a research scientist at the USDA ARS in Beltsville, a very prestigious bee lab in the United States, talking about his research, his latest research about the genetic diversity of honeybees in the United States. And the conversation was really interesting, and people was very reacted to it, because there is so much in that conversation about apparently the population of the United States, the honeybee population in the United States, are losing their genetic diversity, and this is a concern. So we discuss all the potential problems with that, potential solutions with that. And in today's podcast, I invite Dr. Malcolm Sanford to talk about the podcast itself, because I know Dr. Malcolm Sanford know a lot about these things and can give us a little historic perspective about this whole thing. And so if you're tuning in, I think I give you a little overview about what we're talking about today. So Professor, how they characterize the bees in the past? There is a lot of morphometrics. Do you know have you done this before?
Well, I haven't specifically done it, but I know about it because we were involved in it. Mostly we were involved in it when the Africanized bee was coming out of Mexico and invading the United States. And we weren't sure what's going to happen. And we weren't sure what's going to be Africanized and what isn't. And so what brought that up was the idea that morphometrics was the technology at the time to determine these things, to determine the races of bees. That was the pioneer guy was Rutner. He did that many, many years ago. His papers are still available. But of course, now we're looking at the molecular aspects of it, and that's a whole different kind of situation. And so the technology has moved. It's moved from just measurements of characteristics to the molecular measurements.
Yeah, there was a problem in the past. When that happened, Professor, when was the bees getting into the border and we start this whole activity to, in this whole beekeeping community and researchers in the United States, you start to be concerned about the potential introduction of the Africanized bees into the United States. And I know you're involved a little bit on that. You cover a lot of this with articles that we're going to leave here in the description of the video or in the notes of the podcast.
Yeah, that's right. I have information on that, and of course, we worked with different kinds of people. And as I recall, if you look at the history of the Africanized bee, if you look at Venezuela, this is where it
Yeah.
all kind of came down. And most of those researchers were at the USDA Bee Lab in Baton Rouge, in Louisiana, and that was the start of the concept of using morphometrics to measure the bees and try to figure out what kind of bees were coming out of Brazil up through and going to be going through the Panama into Mexico and in the United States.
Wow, that was a while ago, and as the
Too long ago. That's right. Yeah.
that's the prediction. Yeah, I never thought, you know, as a Brazilian from the city, I got my college in the city, in the same university where the Africanized bees were released. I know the whole story very well and how fast they propagate. It will be almost impossible to stop them the way things were going. And so they are here right now in the south. And so, and Dr. Alburaki was able to show with genetics where those traits are. Actually, there is a lot in Texas, a lot in Florida. I was surprised on some states there was in the north, which is more cold. I got a little concerned about that. It's not exactly the Africanized bees, but there is some traits of Africanization that we know that was found in some states in the north where we believed Africanized bees cannot reach because of the cold. So this whole thing is very fascinating to me, and I encourage, if you didn't see the video, my video with Dr. Alboraki, let me show you here how you can find in my YouTube channel, because a lot of people were confused how they can find my video sometimes. So let me once and for all show you how things work here in YouTube. So right here in this page that you see here in front of me, you see my YouTube channel. This is my YouTube channel. You can scroll down and you're gonna see here home. You can go to the videos, the short videos, the live streams, the podcast, the playlist, the community tab. But I think the best way, the easiest way is to scroll down, and then you're gonna see here my popular videos. You're gonna see all the videos, and those are the earliest video, the latest videos that I published. And then if you scroll down, you can see also the live streams. So, for example, my last live stream was Dr. Muhammad Alburaki, so you can find right here. This is the thumbnail. Or sometimes this is a podcast, and then you can click in the podcast. For example, go to the podcast, go down and find the Alburaki one. So you can see his face here, you can see his name here, and when you click it, boom, then we start. So I'm gonna keep this open here so we can get the graphics in case we're gonna show anything to the public. So Professor, let's continue this conversation. I'm gonna remove this for now so we can continue this. So what else got your attention in in my conversation with Dr. Alburaki? I know you got interested in the history. I remember you telling me that. There is anything else got your attention in that conversation? Because I want to talk about something with you, but I want to know if you have something else to say.
Well, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm not educated in the process that he used.
Hmm.
So it's kind of hard to know exactly what he did and so on. We do
Yeah.
know now that we have a certain amount of we have the various haplotypes and so on that he found. And to me, that's the most important thing, is to not so much how it happened and so on, but what they mean. And I like your idea of having an American bee. I think it's
Oh, let's talk about that then,
a little
Professor.
bit
Let's talk
broad.
about that.
It's a little bit broader than I might think, because again, what is the Americas?
Let's talk about that. Yeah, I think that's the thing that interested me the most in that conversation. Yes, the genetic diversity is going down. This is a concern. Yes. However, there is something in that conversation that start a whole side project for me now, which is I call the search for the American bee.
Right.
And what I'm trying to say here is in that conversation, Dr. Alburaki was able, in that research paper he published, he was able to identify some new haplotypes in the United
Haplotypes, yeah,
States.
haplotypes. He's got 14 new haplotypes, I think.
Yes,
Yeah, yeah.
that doesn't match with anything
Anything
else
else?
in the
Anything
world.
else? Right. That is
So
very
this
cool.
is an American bee. So finally, after how many years now? 400. So the bees were introduced in the 1600. So it took forever, which is how genetic evolution works. Takes a long time, and now we start to see in some parts and some states some haplotypes coming that's different from anything else.
Right.
So this means we are finally seeing the birth of the American bee. I think
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's
yeah.
it's quite interesting to me.
Well, remember too the 1922 law that exists on the books. There's a
Yeah.
law that you cannot import honeybees in the United States. And we know
Well,
that that certainly is not realistic. I mean, over the years, people have imported the things all over the place and whatever else, and so that is true. The idea of the American bee, I think it should be categorized a little bit narrower than that. But anyway, that's the. I think in the haplotype it is. The haplotype is the American bee, the C1 North American or American haplotype that he talked about. That would be the
yeah,
one. I think that was the one, wasn't it?
he was able to find
No, the
some. I don't
Carniolan
remember.
bee. Now that was the most
Carniolan
interesting thing. The Carniolan bee was the most the haplotype in the Carniolan bee, not the Italian bee, because I would
was
have said the Italian
interesting.
bee for years and years and years was the bee.
What that mean, Professor, is that some people, some places, or some bees that was in nature wild were able to be there, isolated themselves a little bit, or beekeepers were helping somehow that
Yeah. Oh
and
yeah.
the generation of those bees already started. And I got so interested that I start a side project that I call Finding the American Bee. I don't know, I need to come up with the name.
Well, remember
But
we talked about history, the Aboriginal idea of the bees when the bees first came, right? And they came and the bees were the pioneers of in the United States, certainly, of moving westward. The people moved west, but before the honeybees moved west, and that was called, they call that the white man's fly.
the
That
white
was
man fly.
what was taken at that time. But yeah, so that started right when everything started. The bees took off, and you could have probably what would be considered to be the white man's fly on the west coast for a long time before all the other importations occurred later on.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I'm interested in that, and so I start to go after the bee because I'm interested to know what the American bees do, what they are, what their
right,
differences.
right.
If there is any behavioral differences that we're gonna find on those bees. So I know, talking with Dr. Roboraki, I know that Vermont was one of the places they start to find those haplotypes. So I got a plane and I spent a week with a bunch of beekeepers that I stopped by to talk about with the Moraz family, Charles
Yeah,
Moraz.
Charlie Mraz. Yeah, yeah,
Charles
yeah,
Moraz,
yeah.
yeah. So I
Mhm.
stopped there. I stopped to talk to Mike Palmer,
Okay, yeah,
uh,
yeah, yep.
Andrew. So I stopped and talk a lot of interesting people, and to just so I can't say too much, but there is videos coming about that
Oh yeah.
from
Okay.
about Vermont beekeeping, but it's this is part of my hunting now side project to find the American bee. So
Right. Okay. Well, I think it's an interesting thing, the way to go. And of course, remember the Canadians have their own bee in a way, to some degree,
yeah,
and also throughout the United States, you've got the Florida bee, I'm sure, and there's a California bee, and now there's
yeah,
the movement. Remember the movement? Every year, thousands of colonies are moved out of Florida. Where? To California.
yeah.
To pollute I mean, not to pollute, but to
I
populate,
think
to do the
I'm I'm
pollination of
not
the almonds.
sure. I'm not sure the American bee will be part of this movement, Professor, because genetically, to a new haplotype to happen, need to have isolation,
Right.
environmental
That's
isolation
right.
somehow. And if the bees are part of this cycle of the commercial beekeeping in America, I think it would be very hard for them to develop these new haplotypes. But I don't know. So it's something to investigate for sure. But if I need to guess, it's going to be in those states that beekeepers are more isolated. They like to do things in a different ways, not the same way of everybody else's.
Right.
So that would be my guess.
And you got different climate areas too. There's
Yeah,
certain so
yeah.
that's another aspect of this that's real important. And so that's the situation. Remember what he said in his podcast. The most important thing was what? Diversity.
Diversity, yes.
Diversity. He said that a number of times. And even though he's doing all this other stuff, trying to find some isolated areas with bees and so on, really his, and I think our focus here and elsewhere is we should have as much diversity as possible.
I agree with you, Professor. And I cannot stress that enough to beekeepers, commercial beekeepers, backyard beekeepers. Maybe sometimes I have conversations that it's hard for the people to realize that if they don't travel too much to see other bees in other environments.
Yeah,
I got that. So I
yeah.
encourage perhaps people to go to Europe, go to other places to see the bees and what people can do with bees with the different
Yep.
traits, different ways.
Mhm.
Because here in America it's become so equal everything, and this is dangerous. When something happens, then 40-60% of the bees are gone because you don't have the genetic diversity protection, you know is making the system stronger. So
Well,
we need to work on it.
you do have some of that because you have an industry of people that are raising honeybees. That's a whole nother area.
Yep.
Remember in the historic analysis, Canada, before the coming of the tracheal mite, Canada's model was to kill all their bees after they harvested the honey. They killed all the bees, and then they bought bees from the South, the United States South, in the spring of the next year. This allowed them to keep all the honey that the bees made and sell it instead of feeding it back to the bees during the wintertime. And they create a whole new ball game with the whole new series of bees coming out of the United States. Where they come from? The southern United States, Georgia, that kind of thing. So that was also part of what created the Canadian bee. By the way, we're still involved in that.
Yeah, I don't even like to hear those things, Professor, because it's so, those business model that you just kill a bunch of bees for profit just doesn't click with my philosophy of
Well, there you
beekeeping at
go.
all.
But it's a business. Business is money. Money is
I
money.
know,
Business is
yeah.
business. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Business is some business are models I think are very destructive, and I'm against them. I'm very clear about that.
Right, right. Yeah, yeah. But anyway, that's where we are with this. I think the real message of the whole thing is the more diverse you are, the better off you are.
Yes,
Whether you
I
know what haplotype you're doing or whatever else is it's kind of impossible to figure that out at the moment
yeah.
because we just don't have the technology to do that. We're getting closer with the molecular than we were with the other, the the morphometrics. Morphometrics was a
Yeah.
whole different ball game. Yeah.
The diversity is very, very important because most of the things in beekeeping we can't control. All the variables we can't control. The only thing that could shield us a little bit more is to have more diversity that can, make a buffer when the bad things arrive. We do, instead of lose, all the
Yeah,
60%.
we learned that with the tracheal mite. We learned that with varroa.
Yep, we lose
We're
less.
learning as we go along. The whole thing is involved in that situation.
People, so sometimes people don't believe me when I said in Brazil, like 96% of the people don't treat for anything, don't do anything. It's just, and they keep producing. So there is a model. The
Yeah,
bees
yeah,
figured it out.
yeah, right. And of course, that again has to do with mostly interesting to me is moisture, water.
Yeah, we can talk about that in another episode, Professor. This
That's
is
right,
another
because that's
episode.
really what drives Africanized bees. Water. If they
Yeah,
can't get water, they
water.
move.
Yeah, they
That's it.
chase water.
Yeah,
That's what
they
they
gotta
did
have
in
water.
Africa. They chase water.
Yeah.
Okay, Professor, I think this is a good time for us to end this one. But I want to remind the people at home what we're doing here, like the structure. I'm gonna have many live streams with guests, researchers, and then myself and Dr. Malcolm Sanford here. We're gonna analyze a little deeper those podcasts and those conversations. So if you have questions about any of my podcasts and those live interviews that I have, please don't hesitate to send that out so I can show to Dr. Sanford and then so we can discuss here in the podcast. So, with that in mind, Professor, I want to thank you for your time, and you guys at home, thank you for listening.
All right. See you on the next podcast.
See you guys in the next one. Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Inside the Hive.tv podcast is brought to you by our fans on Patreon. On Patreon, you can access all episodes before anybody else and exclusive content, like behind-the-scenes videos, live streams, and more. If you want to learn more about honeybees and help me to make more content about honeybees to everybody, please visit patreon.com/InsideTheHive.tv and join our community.